All right, we're about to jump into one of the most infamous and controversial books ever written, Machiavelli's The Prince. But what if I told you its whole sinister reputation is basically built on a 500-year-old misunderstanding? Let's get into it.
So let me just ask you this. If someone called you Machiavellian, how would you take it, right? Is it a compliment like, wow, you're a brilliant strategist? Or is it a pretty nasty insult about your character? For most people, it's definitely not a good thing.
And that's because the word is taken on this really dark meaning, Machiavellianism. The idea that to get what you want, any method is fair game. It's the ultimate philosophy of the ends justify the means, and it's all about deception and a ruthless hunger for power. But here's the twist. This whole popular, sinister view of Machiavelli and his book, it's pretty much a myth, a massive historical misconception. To get to the truth, we have to peel back the layers of that scary reputation and actually meet the man who wrote it. So who was the real Niccolò Machiavelli? Was he some kind of teacher of evil, whispering in the ears of tyrants? Or was he something else entirely? To really get his book, you first have to understand the world he was living in. And wow, what a world it was. You gotta understand, Machiavelli wasn't writing this from some peaceful, stable country. He was a man living in a totally broken world, a world defined by absolute chaos, constant war, and just a brutal struggle for survival. The Italy Machiavelli knew wasn't one unified country. Not even close. It was more like a fractured chessboard of powerful city-states. You had Florence, Venice, the Papal States, and they were all locked in this never-ending cycle of war, shifting alliances, and betrayal. In this world, your ally today could literally be your executioner tomorrow. And Machiavelli was right in the thick of it. For years, he was a high-ranking diplomat for his beloved hometown, the Florentine Republic, a really skilled public servant. But then in 1512, his entire world just collapsed. The powerful Medici family, who used to rule, came roaring back into power. Machiavelli was fired immediately, accused of plotting against them, and then thrown in prison where he was tortured, horribly. After he got out, he was left exiled, broke, and totally desperate. And this is where the biggest myth about the prince just completely falls apart. Because he wrote it right after this horrible, traumatic downfall. And he didn't write it for the public or for future philosophers to study. No, he wrote it for one very, very specific reason. He wrote it for the very people who had just had him tortured, the new Medici rulers. Stripped of his career, his reputation, everything, Machiavelli wanted to prove he was still valuable. He wanted to show his new bosses that his knowledge of how power really works was something they absolutely needed. So, here's the crucial point, the main takeaway. The Prince was never meant to be a handbook for evil. It was, essentially, the most intense and brilliant political resume ever written. It was a direct pitch to the new ruler of Florence, basically saying, look, I understand the brutal realities of power better than anyone alive. You need me. Hire me. Okay, so with that context, let's look at the actual lessons in the book. When you see them as cold, hard observations from a seasoned diplomat and not a devil, they take on a completely new meaning. This is a cold, unfiltered look at human nature and power. One of his most famous ideas is this concept of the ruler having two sides. He said a prince has to learn from two animals, the lion and the fox. The lion, well, that's brute force. It's powerful, it can scare off wolves, but it's not very bright. It walks right into traps. The fox, on the other hand, is super cunning. It can spot the traps from a mile away, but it's too weak to defend itself from the wolf. See, a ruler can't just be one or the other. To survive and succeed, a leader needs the strength of the lion and the cunning of the fox. You've got to know when it's time to use force and when it's time to use your wits. It's all about balance. Now let's get to one of his most chilling and, honestly, revealing observations. He asks us to think about a really brutal question, a question about human nature. What do people find harder to forgive? The person who killed their father or the person who took their property? His answer is just shocking. Men forget the death of their father sooner than the loss of their inheritance. Now pause for a second. He wasn't saying this is a good thing or that it's moral. He was just saying, look, this is how people actually behave. And if you're a ruler who ignores this reality and makes choices based on how you wish people were, well, you're going to fail. And you're probably going to get overthrown. So if the book was this realistic, practical analysis born from a violent time, how in the world did it become known as the Devil's Handbook?
Well, its reputation has been on a wild ride for the last 5 centuries. First centuries after it was published, The Prince was considered pure evil. I mean, the church banned it. Kings and queens all over Europe denounced it. Machiavelli himself was seen as a literal teacher of wickedness. It wasn't until the 1800s that thinkers like Hegel started to look at the book in its historical context, seeing it not as a moral guide, but as a groundbreaking, brutally honest analysis of politics, maybe even the first real work of modern political science. I mean, just think about that. It took nearly 300 years for the world to even start seeing this book differently. 3 whole centuries of it being branded as the ultimate guide to tyranny before it was finally reevaluated as a work of political genius. It's a pretty powerful lesson in how much context can completely change our understanding of an idea. And that brings us to the final, lingering question that makes this book so endlessly fascinating. Was Machiavelli writing a how-to guide for tyrants to get and keep power? Or, by laying bare all the ruthless, cynical tactics of rulers, was he secretly writing a warning for the rest of us? A playbook of power that, once we understand it, could help ordinary people recognize and maybe even resist manipulation. That's the question that keeps this 500-year-old job application so dangerously relevant today.
All right, let's talk about a book that for 500 years has been praised, banned, and argued over like pretty much nothing else. It's a book whose title, The Prince, has become a kind of code word for being ruthless and ambitious. So today, we're going to do a deep dive into Niccolo Machiavelli's masterpiece and try to figure out what's real and what's just myth. I mean, this book literally gave us a new word, Machiavellian. Right away, you probably think of, sneaky politicians, backstabbing coworkers, that kind of thing. But here's the catch. That popular idea is exactly the myth we're here to bust. To really get what The Prince is about, you've got to understand the guy who wrote it and the crazy world he was living in. So, who was this guy, Niccolo Machiavelli? Was he really this teacher of evil, whispering dark secrets to dictators? Or was there something else going on entirely? Well, like with most things, the truth is a lot more complicated. And this is where it gets really interesting. The way people saw him was just night and day. On one hand, you had the church calling him the devil incarnate, saying he was teaching rulers to just throw morality out the window. But then you have this other side, people who saw him as an incredible patriot, a guy who even said he loved his city more than his own soul. So how can one person be seen in 2 completely opposite ways? Well, it all comes down to the context. You've got to remember, Machiavelli wasn't just some philosopher chilling in an ivory tower. He was living in 15th century Italy, and it was a total mess. The country was shattered into pieces, city-states were constantly at war, and foreign armies were marching all over the place. We're talking total chaos. He looked around and thought, we desperately need one strong leader to stop the bleeding and pull this country together. So this book, it wasn't some abstract theory. It was practically a cry for help. Okay, so to really get his advice, you have to get on his wavelength. And that all starts with his view of human nature. And let me tell you, it is not exactly optimistic. He wasn't interested in how people should act. He was laser-focused on how they actually act. Yeah, that sounds pretty harsh, right? But for Machiavelli, he wasn't making a moral judgment. He was just observing. He saw it as a simple fact of life. He's basically saying, look, at their core, people are wired for self-interest. They'll talk a big game about loyalty, but when the chips are down, their own skin comes first. And this next quote, wow. It just perfectly captures his whole point. He's saying people will get over the death of a parent faster than they'll get over losing money. Why? Because you can't bring your father back, but you can always try to get your property back. That desire, that grievance over what you've lost, he believed that's the thing that burns inside a person the longest. Here's a perfect modern way to think about it. Picture driving in traffic. You see a beat-up old clunker, and maybe you don't think twice about cutting in front of it.
But what happens when a $250,000 supercar pulls up next to you? Suddenly, you're the most polite, careful driver on the road, right? You give it plenty of space. It's the same person behind the wheel, but their behavior completely changes based on their perception of power. For Machiavelli, that's human nature in a nutshell.
So if you accept this view of humanity, that we're all self-interested and we respect power more than anything, then all that infamous evil advice in The Prince starts to sound less like evil and more like just cold, hard logic. It becomes a ruler's guide to survival. This is one of his most chilling pieces of advice, for sure. What he means is that taking the middle path is the most dangerous thing you can do. If you conquer a territory and just kind of rough them up a bit, you've created enemies who are still strong enough to get revenge. So he says you only have two real options: win them over completely or totally eliminate them as a threat.
And you can see these two extremes play out in history, clear as day. Look at Julius Caesar. He conquered the Gauls, and then he chose the caress them path. He brought them into the Roman system, gave them opportunities, and made them part of the empire. Then you have Genghis Khan. When the Khwarezmian Empire defied him, he went with crush them. I mean, his armies left nothing alive. Two totally different methods, but from Machiavelli's brutally practical perspective, they were both effective.
And the cold logic just keeps on coming. First, never help someone else get powerful to serve your own ends, because you're just creating a future rival you won't be able to control. Second, it's better to be feared than to be loved. Why? Simple. Love is a choice someone makes, and they can unmake it just as easily. But fear of punishment, that's way more reliable. And finally, talk is cheap. You can persuade people for a little while, but in the long run, you've got to have the muscle to back it up.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. This was all written 500 years ago for some prince in Italy. It's easy to just write it off as ancient history. But does any of it still apply? Let's ask, who are the princes today?
Well, for most elected leaders in a democracy, not really. Presidents, prime ministers, they have term limits. They've got laws and constitutions they have to follow. They answer to the public. Their power is temporary, and it's kept in check. They're not the absolute rulers Machiavelli had in mind.
No, to find the true modern princes, you gotta look elsewhere. You have to look at figures who often rule their domains for life, whose power can be immense and sometimes totally unchecked. Think about some of the most powerful CEOs or tech founders who control these vast digital empires, or the heads of those giant family-run conglomerates in South Korea, the chaebol. In those worlds, where power can be absolute, Machiavelli's advice still rings very, very true. But now we get to the final, and I think the most important twist in this whole story. We've been asking how rulers can use this book. But maybe, just maybe, we've been asking the wrong question the entire time.
Let's just entertain a pretty radical idea for a second. What if Machiavelli's real audience wasn't the prince? What if it was the people? What if this book isn't a how-to guide, but a how-to watch out for guide?
If you look at it that way, everything changes. The Prince suddenly becomes an essential textbook for every single citizen in a democracy. It's like a negative tutor. It doesn't teach you how to be good. It teaches you how power-hungry people think and act. It exposes the tyrant's playbook. And by understanding that cold, hard calculus of power, we're all better armed to recognize it and defend ourselves from it. And this is the most empowering idea of all. In a democracy, the ultimate power doesn't rest with one person on a throne. It rests with all of us. Every citizen has a piece of that power and responsibility. And in that sense, we are all princes. It's our job to understand power so we can use our own share wisely.
So here's the ultimate lesson. Power isn't evil by itself, but it is always dangerous. The second we, the citizens, turn our backs, stop paying attention, that's when it will absolutely corrupt the people who have it. Being vigilant is the price we pay for freedom.
So, is The Prince a dangerous book? Absolutely. But its real danger, and its genius, isn't in teaching tyrants new tricks. It's in teaching the rest of us what to watch out for. Understanding how power actually works isn't cynical. It's the first, most critical step for any citizen who wants to stay free.